of the topics that will most consistently be trending on any social media page or showing up in headlines in the news is the terrible fate our planet faces. It just seems like every environmentalist and scientist out there is telling us that we're just a few years away from dying, which is why I was really excited to read this book, Not the End of the World, by Hannah Ritchie. It is a fantastic book, and in this little video, I want to go over the cool things that I learned, the things that surprised me the most, and also just how great this book is. To give you just a general overview, this is written by Hannah Ritchie, who is one of the editors behind the website Our World in Data. If you're unfamiliar with this website, you are in for a treat. It is such a refreshing and interesting website. I use it all the time when I'm teaching my undergrads. Often on the first day of class, I point them to this website as a great resource for them to start thinking about the trends that they're interested in, possibly the research topics, or just finding inspiration, or just finding the data that is surrounding the topics that we talk about in class. So I'm already a huge fan of Hannah and the work that her team is doing over at Our World in Data. To give you the overview of what this book is covering, it's dealing with a lot of the, I'll say, myths around the environment and let's say doomerism. But when I say the myths, like, I don't want you to think that this is some person coming through and saying, oh, everybody's crazy, don't worry, like, there are no problems at all. I really appreciate the balanced and pragmatic approach that Hannah's taking here. Because while she's dispelling myths, she's never trivializing the issues that she's talking about. She's going through the whole planet, starting at the top, talking about air, climate, making her way down to the earth, and eventually going into the sea and getting concerned about what our fish populations look like. She's covering everything, and she knows that there are problems there. But one of the stories that she tells that really stuck out to me was how she went to college to be an environmental studies major, or something along those lines of making sure she understood the environment and these big issues. And every day while she was in college, she was constantly bombarded by the grim prospect that awaited us in our future, and how everything was going to be terrible within a couple of years. And she sincerely believed that. She came out of college thinking there was no opportunity for the human race and the globe going forward. But she learned differently when she started going through the data and understanding what our world was really like. So she went through and wrote this book to kind of get rid of that pessimism and those myths that just constantly come at us and sell newspapers and clicks on websites. And she's coming through and just giving such a good approach to it. I loved the way that she did this. It just convinced me, honestly, that there are more problems than I normally think about. I think of the ones that she covered, the ones that are probably on my mind most, you have like climate change is an obvious one. And I think that's it. Like, air pollution is sometimes salient. We live in an area where inversions come and trap pollution in our valley. I saw a lot of pollution when I was in China. I'm wearing my China shirt right now, actually, now that I think about it. Those are some of the problems that are salient to me and I see. But she convinced me that there are actually more problems out there that we need to be concerned about. But what I love is that she also convinced me that the solutions are here. Or if they're not fully developed, they're on the horizon and they can totally be solved. And that's why I have these books out here. It really fits in the same literature as some of my favorite books dealing with resources and the environment. I have Charles Mann's Wizard and the Prophet. Man, that one is so good. And then More from Less by Andrew McAfee, also really good. Changes my views on how everything's going along. So what is like one of the cool things that I learned in this book? One thing that stood out to me that kind of connected a few puzzle pieces for me was when she asked, how much more food would we have to produce to feed the world a normal diet of like 2,000 to 2,500 calories. Now, a lot of places in the world do not get that many calories. In the US, we usually get that many calories and sometimes a lot more. But food insecurity is definitely much larger of an issue than food security in the United States is. So what does it take for us to feed the rest of the world? And she points out that we already produce enough food to give everyone in the world a full daily diet. Now, why don't we already do that? Well, there's a couple of reasons, and that's what I love about this book. It's going through and giving very precise explanations about why these problems aren't solved yet. Some of them are things like food waste. A lot of food is wasted not just in the grocery stores and in restaurants, but when it's being harvested or when it's being grown. Like, a lot of food is lost that shouldn't be lost. But then another really big problem, especially in the United States, is that half of our food that we produce doesn't even go to humans. Half of that is going to feeding animals. Now, we eat that indirectly, but we could be receiving those calories ourselves. They're not as tasty. So, there's going to be a trade-off. We do need to give some of that food to animals for us to eat, but maybe we're not giving them to the most efficient animals to eat. And then another large part that's in that 50% that's not going to humans is stuff that we make for biofuels. In the United States, we produce a lot of corn to go into ethanol to fuel our cars. And it's a hugely inefficient way to fuel our cars and get those biofuels. But I mean, I've always known that there's these like government subsidies and issues around creating biofuels from corn, for instance, in the United States. There's just a huge lobby for it and it's a lot of political capture. But I don't think I realized how inefficient that was. And also just like all the other harms it creates, like the need to just clear more and more forests to get those biofuels. I mean, I get why people thought that this was a good strategy. Oil is a finite resource. As we keep using it, we deplete it. And, agriculture is something that we can renew. So we might as well like focus on something that we can keep renewing when our oil resources are going out. But it just turns out that's not a super effective way to do it. Electricity and, now that we have electric cars, like that's clearly the path forward. We need to be focusing more on that stuff. But there's one thing that, as an economist, this for sure changed my worldview, because I talk to people who are worried about the future of the world and whether we can keep having economic growth without destroying the planet. And they say, a lot of times we need to just go back to those earlier days when we were living sustainably. And I know that going back to earlier times is a terrible idea because people were just super poor and people were dying, and that is just not a very persuasive argument to try and get us to have a better world. But it didn't quite have a rebuttal for people who said, we need to be living sustainably. We need to have sustainable development. But that is like one of the first things that this changed my worldview on, was pointing out that the definition of sustainable development shows us that we have never had sustainable development, because there was this big 1980s convention in the UN that they were studying this issue. And then in 1987, they came up with a definition of sustainable development, and it had two halves. It said sustainable development meets the needs of the current generation without compromising the ability of future generations to meet their needs. And what I love about this is Hannah is pointing out, most of the time we focus on that ability to fulfill future generations' needs. But part of that definition is meeting the current generation's needs. And when we look through the past at this poverty, at high death rates, high disease, no generation was able to meet their needs. Like when you have a third of children dying before they turn 5, you are not meeting that generation's needs. And so we are only just now getting to a point where we're able to meet this generation's needs. And there are plenty of places where we are failing at that, and we need to get there. But to say that we we should scale back on development so we can have sustainable development is ignoring the fact that we need to meet this generation's needs, and that's going to require more economic development. The argument is so clear and so compelling that I've been able to talk about this with environmentalists, and I don't know if I have persuaded them, but she has certainly persuaded me that we need to focus on growing now as well as preserving things for the future. But let me tell you about the most surprising thing about this book. The reason why I picked it up was because I was asked to talk to environmentalists about these issues, and I have a video coming out pretty soon about what that experience was like. And I was reading this in preparation for that and trying to understand the issues. And I surprisingly found myself like reading 30 pages at a time. I had to fit my reading in between, doing my work and doing things like YouTube and, like taking care of my family. So a lot of times it can be difficult for me to make progress on books, but easily I'd sit down and find myself engrossed in this book. That's because the most surprising thing about this book is how well it is written. It's hard to find books that are based in data and presenting that data to a lay audience that aren't also just so caught up in academic writing. I've found this in other books that I'm reading right now where I'm reading a paragraph and I realize that I'm just not even paying attention anymore because there's something about the language and how it's written that just makes me uninterested and keep going. Not the case with this book. It is shockingly well written. Again, the shocking isn't the background. I mean, clearly with their website, Our World in Data, they've been honing this craft at communicating these issues to a broader audience. It's just, I don't come across books like this that are founded so deeply in research and yet are so accessible to anyone. I loved that part about this, and I think that you'll find that this is an incredibly compelling book as you go through and read it, and you'll just find that you read it almost in one sitting. Certainly, I think this took me less than a week to get through the whole thing. Now, some of you were already aware that this video was coming because I wrote about it in my newsletter. That's where I try to give insights on what I'm reading, previews of what's coming up, as well as just the synthesis of what I'm thinking about in economics. If you haven't been reading my newsletter, go ahead and check it out in my description, subscribe, and you can support the channel while you're there too.